Alright, well, hi. I just finished playing my first game of the 45-45 League season, and I'm gonna do a quick review of it. My opponent in this game is called Fishy Vishy. Fishy spelled Fischy, so it's very clever. Okay, so anyways, I had the white pieces in this game. I played e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. This is known as the Four Knights Sicilian, the Four Knights variation of the Sicilian, which is not the most common, but we end up transposing into something a little more familiar soon enough. Knight db5, this is sort of the main move for white, although nowadays knight takes c6 is also popular, and that it's quite a decent move as well. After b takes c6, the idea is to push e5 and get a space advantage, and white has reasonable chances there, I think. But okay, knight db5, well, looking at the d6 square, and sort of half compelling black to play d6. There are other moves as well. Bishop b4 is possible, and after a3, bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, bishop d3. We reach another of these sorts of positions where black's got an isolated pawn and white's got two bishops. So like white's undoubtedly better, but the question is sort of how much better, and people that play this line are sort of claiming that black is, you know, very solid, and one weakness isn't enough to win the game, which, okay, fair enough. Black's got some measure of activity. He can try pushing his pawn to d4 at some point. There's also the move bishop c5, which is the Cobra variation, which allows white to put his knight on d6. This is a little bit riskier. But anyways, d6 is clearly sort of the main move, the best move that black has in this position. White's point is bishop f4, otherwise the knight would get kicked back after a6 and white wouldn't have really gained much. So bishop f4, prompting e5, because if knight e5 then queen d4 is quite strong. So e5, bishop g5, and now we transpose into the Sveshnikov, which I used to avoid the Sveshnikov by playing, well, when they reach it via the normal move order, which is this. I used to avoid the Sveshnikov by playing bishop b5, the Rossolimo, which I think is a decent line. But recently I changed my repertoire to go for d4 against all of d6, knight c6, e6, g6, whatever. So I'd sort of prepared this line against the Sveshnikov, but I hadn't, like, I don't think I've ever faced the Sveshnikov in a serious game because I was always avoiding it. So this is sort of, I guess, my first slow game that I've played against the Sveshnikov. But anyways, a6, knight a3, b5. And so that kind of explains some of the confusion later. Knight d5, and we've got a Sveshnikov, but just with one extra move on each side, which sort of throws off the move order count, which can be a bit annoying. But anyway, so knight d5, I played this as sort of the more positional main line. There's also bishop takes f6, which prompts g takes f6, and this is tends to be very sharp. But okay, knight d5, bishop e7, queen a5 check is also a possible move here, but people don't tend to play that so much these days because, first of all, after bishop d2, your idea is to go back to d8, and so white can take a draw with bishop g5, but white also has reasonable winning attempts such as bishop d3 and c4 and so forth. So anyway, bishop e7, these moves are nowadays sort of played automatically. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. The strategic idea behind what white's doing is he's eliminating the knight on f6, which can influence the key d5 square. And this sort of main idea of the Sveshnikov is you're giving up the d5 square, but you're hoping for active play in your turn, often involving the f5 break, sometimes play on the queen side, and so on. Now, and white's giving up his piece that can never directly fight for the control over the d5 square for, yeah, this knight on f6, which was directly influencing it, and so on and so forth. So anyways, white's got two main moves here. Here I was sort of debating back and forth whether I should go for c3 or should go for c4, which is the other main move. Eventually I decided to go for c3. This is the line I'd looked at more recently. After c4, white's just back normally goes b4, white goes knight c2, white's got very nice control over the d5 square. but also arguably he's weakened the d4 square a little bit. But he's got more space. Sometimes you can think about pushing c5 under the right set of circumstances. You can play a3 in some cases to undermine the queenside. You can set up with like g3, bishop g2, castles, knight e3, h4 to take the square away from the bishop, and then you can play something like queen d3, rook to the d file, and try to pressure the d6 pawn. But anyways, in the game I ended up going for c3, 12 c3, or 11 c3 if you're getting here via the standard move order. Black castled. I played knight c2. This is the idea of c3, is to bring the knight back into the game and can come to e3 at some stage and allow for the a4 break to occur. Black played bishop g5, and the idea of bishop g5 is oftentimes if a knight comes to e3, black will think about taking it. Sometimes, because again, it's the same thing that white did. White gave up his dark square bishop for a knight to gain indirect control over d5, and black oftentimes considers a similar maneuver, giving up his dark square bishop for a white knight to weaken white's control over d5. Okay. So I played the move a4, and actually sometimes another main move here for black is rook to b8 with the purpose of preventing a4. Sometimes they'd still do play a4, but the idea is basically takes, and if you take with the rook, the b2 pawn might be hanging. It's not totally ideal. You can still play this way for white, like you can play knight cb4, that's a legal move. There, Vachier Lagrave has played this a couple times. Bishop b7 and queen takes a4. Anyways. But since black didn't play rook b8, white is free to go ahead with a4 just to put some pressure on the queen side. And in fact, if you play rook b8, a b5, this is generally considered to be better for white, I think. And white scores well here in the database, just simply bishop d3, for example. And the idea is this pawn can become weak in the long term. Sort of similar vein to Spanish, you see this a4 idea in the Spanish as well. But unlike in the Spanish, black tends to meet a4 with b takes a4. Now, yeah. So the idea with b takes a4 is there's no static weakness there's no fixed weakness on b5 anymore. And after rook takes a4, well, this pawn looks fairly ugly, but the idea is to play a5, and actually the pawn tends to be quite safe on a5. And black can argue that maybe the b2 pawn is also a source of weakness. Bishop c4. This is still the game. And now the main move for black is indeed rook to b8. When white goes b3. And, well, I just wanted to show one sort of cool idea in this line. Black plays king h8, oftentimes just to get out of this diagonal. Maybe he'll play f5 at some point. Knight c to e3, g6. Again, maybe supporting f5. h4, which is a pawn sacrifice. If you go back with the bishop, then h5, and the king side will likely start to come open. Bishop takes h4, g3, bishop g5, f4, e takes f4, g takes f4. Now the main move is bishop h4 check to try to disturb the king, and that's actually generally the only move that black plays here. But if he plays a move like bishop to f6, white has a fantastic idea that, well, it's fairly well known now, but it's still no less spectacular in my opinion. Rook to a2, and this is, with all these pawn pushes, we've cleared the second rank for the rook to come back from a4 to a2 and over to h2. And white's got a very, very strong attack. And in fact, the only games in the Lichess database here are computer games, where Rybka in 2006 and 2007 was playing against Fredis CPU and something called Flying Fat Man. So, okay. Anyways, yeah, so rook b8's the main move. In the game, my opponent played bishop e6. And so this is the first moment where I was sort of thinking, because, well, I'd only really prepared the main line with rook b8. So bishop e6. I played h4, which is sort of a... Did I play h4? No, I played knight ce3. In the database, everybody castles here. And actually, that makes sort of a good deal of sense, considering some of the events that transpire later. But I think knight ce3 is a fine move, even though it is technically a novelty. There's no games in the database. Computer thinks it's okay. If you take on e3... knight takes e3. Well, okay, if you try to swap on c4, the d6 pawn can come under some pressure. and it might just fall off the board soon. So yeah, like I said, oftentimes black does make this exchange. I'm not sure it's the greatest here, but it's certainly possible. But in the game, he played rook to b8, and I played b3, just in an attempt to get something familiar. Computer wants, I think, rook a2 here, which I guess also makes sense, because in some cases the pawn on b3 can actually become a target. This is a bit more solid of a defense. It does look a little bit passive, but that, yeah, is possible as well. But b3 is a fine move, I think. And now we've sort of transposed back to a point where there are games in the database, and my opponent played king h8, which was transposing to even more games, which would occur, via a move order where black like starts with rook b8 and then goes king h8 and then goes bishop e6, which is, I think, fairly reasonable. So yeah, king h8, just getting off this diagonal again and making white think about whether black is intending to play f5. And here a couple moves are possible. First of all, castles is quite a simple move, and that's definitely legal. Black plays g6. One problem for white here is that white no longer has the idea of playing h4 as this pawn sacrifice and swinging the rook over, because there's no rook on the h-file anymore. That's kind of what dissuaded me from castling at this point, is I figured, well, I should keep my rook on h1 for the time being. But there are games here. White scores well with the move king h1, bishop h6, and now queen d3 and just slow positional play. Black plays f5, oftentimes, and, well, it's an unclear position. Let's see what the computer has to say about it. Yeah, it says it's about equal. Maybe white has some slight pull by playing e takes f5 followed by f4, which is another standard idea. But black has counterplay here, for sure. So I played the move h4, which was also the choice of some players such as Peter Leko and Alexander Kalinin and Vitas Pausiauskas and David Baramidze. I don't recognize those last two names. Those might be correspondence games. I'm not sure. But anyways, h4, point of which is to disturb this bishop. It's arguably less strong now than... Well, okay, the pawn being on g6. First of all, if the bishop retreats, then you have h5 to open the king side. But also, this isn't a pawn sacrifice at this point in time. And the reason for that is that without the pawn on g6, after bishop takes h4, white just has to move queen h5, which wins because the bishop is skewered to the mate on h7. So you have to lose the bishop in g5. It's just met with g3, for example. Okay. So h4, if you go bishop back, that's quite passive. White can play, I'm not sure, but probably just queen f3 and maybe knight to f5. Particularly if the bishop goes to h6, I think queen f3 and knight f5 is quite strong. Although I haven't engine checked any of this, but I think, yeah, if black has to go back with the bishop, that's a little bit sad. So bishop takes e3, knight takes e3. This is sort of why the bishop went to g5 in the first place a lot of the time. Okay, so bishop takes e3, knight takes e3. Again, if you take the bishop, I thought that after knight takes c4, this pawn would be in a lot of trouble. But actually, looking at the games in the database, and yes, there are still games in the database, bishop takes c4 has been the most common choice. With the idea, not trying to defend the d6 pawn, because I don't think that's possible anymore, but to just play f5 and get counterplay. I'm guessing these are correspondence games. I can't confirm that for sure, but I do think these are correspondence games. White hasn't lost this position yet. Black's looking for counterplay for the pawn. For example, queen f6 has been tried in a few games. Queen d5, rook b d8, queen c6, rook d6, queen c5. And yeah, white won one and drew one here. Looks reasonable to me. And yeah, my opponent evidently didn't particularly like the look of bringing my knight to c4 either. So he didn't play bishop takes c4. And after quite a long think, or maybe... No, yeah, the long thing happened here. And then this move he played fairly quickly, because I'm guessing he'd, yeah, calculated his next move while thinking about his previous. Queen b6. This has been tried a couple times, once again in the games of the database, and this sort of propelled me into a very long think. I started with 43 minutes, because I was still, not necessarily in theory, but still just making natural moves. And then after, so 43 minutes to start with, and then after this next move I had 14 minutes. Now, this is obviously just completely ridiculous time management. And that, yeah, this is probably the most upsetting part about this game for me, is the fact that I just couldn't decide on a move in this position. Okay, so what's going on? Black is aiming clearly for counterplay along the half along the half-open b file, and he's introducing the idea of maybe taking on c4 and taking on b3. Now, what I thought is, if I allow him to take on b3, if I allow him to take on c4 and take on b3, for example, even if I win one of the d6 pawn or the a5 pawn, that's not better for me. I don't think that assumption is actually true, and that, I guess, sort of speaks to the fact that I really don't have any experience in these types of positions at all. But, yeah, apparently, even if, white trades the b3 pawn for some other pawn and leaves the c3 pawn isolated, it still can be okay for white, because the c3 pawn is sort of defensible, whereas the pawn on a5 or the pawn on d6, whichever one is still left on the board, might also become quite weak. I'm not sure how good white's winning chances are there, but the assumption that if the b3 pawn falls, the c3 pawn will be under threat and white has at best flat equality is probably not a particularly good assumption. With that being said, here are some of the variations I considered. So the d6 pawn is obviously en prise. So here's one line. Bishop takes e6 is an obvious move. F takes e6. This opens the f file for the rook, which looks a bit scary. It adds control over the d5 square, so that you can't just hop a knight there anymore. So I thought if this exchange could not be followed up with queen takes d6, followed by maybe taking on e6, I thought this was strategically undesirable. And the computer sort of agrees, because it gives the move castles, and it says that white is a tiny bit better, compared to, it says white's, more than a tiny bit better if he doesn't make this exchange on e6. I think black's okay here. This is what I thought during the game. Like, if black has a chance to stabilize with a move like rook b d8, I've looked a bit at Sveshnikov position for black. This, I think, tends to be okay. Because you've got, the d5 square is not weak anymore. The d6 pawn, I think, is fairly solid. It's not particularly backwards anymore. On a very ambitious day, black might be able to break with d5 soon. Maybe not on a very ambitious day, but, like, on a good day, you might be able to break with d5. You've got the rook on the half-open f-file, and so on and so forth. But anyways, what I was looking at bishop takes e6, f takes e6 in connection with the move queen takes d6. And this loses for a reason which I'd correctly calculated. Queen takes b3, queen takes c6, and rook to d8. Or rook to c8, sorry. I think it doesn't matter which rook. Yeah, it doesn't really matter which rook. I was looking at rook f to c8. Again, I don't think it really matters. The queen has to maintain connection with the rook, at least if you're purporting to not be just lost right away with white. So queen to d7, rook to d8. Say you go back with the queen. Well, first of all, rook b8 probably forces the queen away from the defense of the rook, because the b5 square is covered by the queen. But anyways, just regardless, just queen b1 check. It's horrible for white. So, anyway, I had this sort of thing in mind. Every time I tried to do something ambitious, like take the d6 pawn, I was always running into skewers on the back rank, which is led to my eventual, after many, many minutes, choice to castle in this position. So that's bishop takes e6 and queen takes d6, which doesn't work. There's also queen takes d6, which was played in one of these two games in the database, which white eventually lost. I thought this wasn't very good either, and the line I looked at was rook f to d8. Queen's got to go to a3. There's no other square for the queen that's safe. And now bishop takes c4. Something. Well, okay, rook takes c4. And mainly what I was looking at was, I was trying to see whether I won a pawn. And when I concluded that I wasn't winning a pawn, I decided this line wasn't worth looking at anymore. And the key variation is queen takes b3, queen takes b3, rook takes b3, and if rook takes c6, there's rook b1 check, and black wins. So white does not win a pawn because you can't take on c6. So I decided, okay, this line's not great, so let's move on to something else. Actually, the computer says something entirely different. The computer says white's seriously better here after either castles or king e2. Let's take king e2 because I think it looks more natural. Its evaluation is kind of fluctuating here. I thought white didn't have anything here. Computer argues that white has something here. I'm not going to take too detailed a look right now at this ending, although maybe it's something worth doing. The a-pawn is passed, but it might be a weakness. I guess a factor is that the knight on c6 is now attacked, now that there's no back rank trick at the moment. No back rank skewer at the moment, so you might have to move the knight into some inconvenient square or defend it in an inconvenient way. But regardless, the computer thinks that that ending is worth entering for white. But it's a bit hard to judge back from this position whether the ending, while thinking about move 21, whether the ending on move 25 is going to be a bit better for white or just equal. or even a bit worse. Because the passed a pawn looks scary. Even if, yeah, didn't look like white had any particular targets, but maybe the a pawn ends up a target. Maybe the e5 pawn is a bit weak as well. So that's queen takes d6, which I rejected. But yeah, so to recap, bishop takes e6 I rejected. It's not I don't think it's a great move. Queen takes d6 I rejected. It's probably a fine move, but yeah, practically it might be worth keeping more attention to the position. So what else did I consider? I considered well, first of all, it took me a very long time to realize that taking on c4 and taking on b3 is not a genuine threat. And when I say a genuine threat, I mean, like, after takes, if you play rook takes, there's no queen takes b3 because the knight hangs. If the queen's back on d1, there's no skewers on the back rank. Okay, but another move I was looking at, under the assumption that the b3 pawn has to be covered, I was looking at the move rook to a3, which looks a bit silly. Well, I don't know, like I said, I haven't played these positions that much. I don't fully know what's typical in these positions, but rook a3 covers this pawn, maybe prepares to go queen to a1 and target this pawn, or to just castle, say, bring the queen to d3 and bring the rook to d1. And the reason why I rejected this was I had a specific line in mind, which is queen to c5. I was going queen to a1, cover the rook, and now, okay, if you play a4 straight away, then, yeah, first of all there's b4, second of all there's takes, bishop takes c4, rook takes c4. But the idea I was worried about was bishop takes c4, knight takes c4. Well, the a5 pawn looks like it's in trouble, but I was seeing black playing a4. And there's no taking with the rook because the knight already captured. There's no b4 because the knight's hanging. And after rook takes a4, rook takes b3, I thought black was totally fine. And he actually probably is totally fine in this specific case. Unless white can, like, improve earlier. In fact, actually, the computer says black can improve earlier with the move f5 here, which I probably looked at as well, but I was worried about a4 in addition. Okay, so yeah, I was right to, but we'll see a similar idea later. And actually, after queen to c5, white shouldn't play queen a1. Queen a1 looked sort of by far the most natural move to me, so I didn't really consider any alternatives. You can play rook a4 back. I think black is likely to play queen b6, and then you kind of have to rethink your choice and do something else. You can also go rook a2, but I'm not sure how much I believe in rook a2. Computer says white's slightly better. But yeah, takes, and I mean, yeah, I don't know about this rook a3, rook a2 stuff. This doesn't look like the way to get an advantage to me, even though it might be the way to get an advantage. Probably not the way to get an advantage, like probably has other things to do. So anyways, those were the moves I sort of looked at. Bishop takes c6, I decided it wasn't good. Queen takes d6, I decided just led to an equal, at best, ending, which is probably not an entirely correct assessment. And rook a3 probably is not a great move in this specific position, although arguably not for essentially the correct reasons, but whatever. So I castled, after realizing that there's no threat to win this pawn straight away because the rook is simply hanging on, the knight is simply hanging on c6. So I castled after like 25 plus minutes of thought for such a simple looking move. But the problem was, I'm like, okay, castles looks like a natural move. I don't have to worry about any back rank skewers anymore, at least for the time being. But the problem is I've just played h4 a couple moves ago, and now I've castled. And I'm like, wouldn't it be nice if I could make use of this h-pawn and the rook on the h-file? It would be nice, wouldn't it? So h5 is probably possible, but again, I'm still always worried about these back rank skewers. Probably white's still better after h5, but I'm like, okay, let's just evacuate the king. You know, we'll deal with everything else later. The move h4 at least had its purpose of forcing black to, like, you know, commit himself with bishop takes e3, although arguably he was sort of wanting to do that anyways. One line I was looking at here was queen to d8. I haven't computer checked this yet, so I'm sort of curious what it thinks about this move. Yeah, I was looking at queen to d8. I thought I was fine. It wants h5. h5 looked a bit loose to me, but okay. I was considering only h5 if the rook was still on the h-file. But okay, the move I wanted, which was g3, is also one of the engine's top choices. And I was looking at stuff like bishop h3. I was going rook e1 and like queen f6. And this didn't look always entirely clear to me, but, you know, I figure if I can avoid getting mated on the light squares, which isn't always a given, the knight does serve some great defensive functions. So I think I should be able to avoid getting mated on the light squares, and white should be strategically better because of the weakness of the pawn on d6. You can probably follow up. You can put a piece on d5. You can put a knight on d5 attacking the queen. You can play bishop d5 probably. You might be able to play queen d5. Looks scary letting the queen get to f3, but the knight on e3 covers it very well. And you can make other moves, rook e2, intending rook d2, probably rook a2 as well. Lots of moves are possible here, and white should be better. But yeah, instead of queen d8, which is probably not a great move, and instead of bishop takes c4, which was played in the one game that reached this position, bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, and now not queen takes b3, but instead knight e7. Black eventually won this game. I think white should still have a little plus here. There's the idea of b4, which I was considering at various points, and there's the simple idea of just playing, for example, queen d3 and rook over. Again, as usual, hard to say if white, you know, is going to win this position, but it certainly should be pleasant for him. He played the move knight e7, which I hadn't really considered, but looks like a normal move. By the way, I should mention, yeah, white's probably threatening to capture on d6 now. I'm like 99% sure, because after, okay, if black makes a random move, actually let's make his random move g6 instead of h6. Queen takes d6, or take first. Maybe. But okay, anyways, in this case, after takes, you play whatever, rook takes c4, and if queen takes c3, the knight hangs on c6. So that's the idea. So black kind of has to defend this pawn, I think. Queen d8 is one way of defending the pawn and attacking this pawn. Knight e7 is another way, bishop takes c4, and knight e7 is an additional way. And once again, okay. Yeah. Here there's some stuff going on. So, already I'm down to 14 minutes. My opponent's at 17 minutes. So, like, I haven't, you know, gotten in disastrous time trouble yet relative to my opponent. But that's coming up. Computer wants just wants the move queen to d3. And there's one game here, okay. I was debating between a few different considerations. The knight's gone from c6 now. So, yeah, if you're operating under the assumption that losing the b3 pawn means you don't have any chances for an advantage anymore, at least under the normal set of circumstances, black is quote-unquote threatening to play bishop takes c6, bishop takes c4, and queen takes b3. Therefore, I spent a while looking at the move rook a3. But I couldn't entirely make it work. And actually, still looking at the database, we've transposed into a game Neumann, I don't know. Neumann Pachovsky from 2008, where white did play the move rook a3. And I was still worried about this queen c5 idea, which black did play in the game. And, well, first of all, okay, queen a1, which is the move I was looking at. So queen a1, and once again I was worried about bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, and a4. But actually, in this case, after rook takes a4, rook takes b3, again, when I was calculating this from a number of moves back, I thought, okay, I'm not really better here. The d6 pawn is weak, sure, but the c3 pawn is isolated as well. What am I going to do? But actually, computer says white's quite a bit better here, like +1. And it does, looking at the position now in front of me, it does look fairly pleasant for white, because rook d1 attacking this pawn. If black has to make a move like knight c8, that's a little bit sad. Again, I think black, this is probably within holding range for black, especially if he manages to get the d5 break in somehow, but yeah. This was maybe worth a little bit more consideration than I gave it. But as well, instead of queen a1, actually the move played in this aforementioned game is just simply rook a2. And this probably should be a bit better for white as well. Just simple moves. And, yeah, if the queen wants to go back to b6 to make this sort of pseudo-threat again, white can probably just ignore it, queen d3, and just operate as usual. For example, takes. Maybe rook takes a5, maybe just rook a3, and then take on a5. And the d6 pawn is fairly weak. But yeah, again, I don't have much experience in this structure. I'm never sure when the d6 pawn is fatally weak, when it's weak but defensible, when it's the c3 pawn just counterbalances it out. I don't know. But anyways, in the game I didn't play rook a3, despite considering it, and despite it being quite a decent move. I didn't play queen d3, which is probably also possible. And actually the top suggestion of the computer. I played the move bishop takes e6. Yeah. Bishop takes e6 is a silly move. Well, it's not that silly, but it basically... The reason why I said earlier bishop takes e6 I didn't think was strategically desirable, yeah, those exact reasons end up coming to happen in the game. So after f takes e6, black's got better control over d5. He can think about getting the d5 break in, and now this rook is active, targeting f2, and it can come to f4, hitting these pawns. And actually, all of these factors do come to play in the game. However, bishop takes e6 is not a terrible move if followed up correctly. And actually, when I played bishop takes e6, I was intending the correct follow-up, which makes this even more silly. By the way, I'm down to 4 minutes at this point. So I'm planning the move knight to c4, which is the correct follow-up. And like I said earlier, I don't think bishop takes e6 is strategically desirable unless white is immediately changing the structure by taking on d6. And I think that assessment is absolutely correct, which makes it even more baffling why I didn't act out on that assessment during the game. Knight to c4 would make sense, because the structure is strategically more desirable for black than the previous structure, so you want to immediately change it. And knight c4 is the move I was intending. Knight c4, queen takes b3, and you reach some ending. Okay, I was calculating, queen takes b3 first, or I think knight takes d6 is actually maybe slightly more accurate, because it doesn't bring the rook to b3 straight away. But I was looking at some ending, like, after... How was I even reaching this ending? I don't remember. I think I was, like, looking at taking here first, and then after rook takes, taking on d6, takes on c3, takes on a5, knight to c6, and I'm like, okay, this is a little better for white, but how much better is it really? These pawns are isolated, but they're not on an open file. This tends to be fairly solid. Black can probably defend them. I'm on the better end of a draw, but it's probably a draw. That assessment is probably correct. Computer's giving plus 0.6. It's probably a draw, but white has the more pleasant time of it for sure. Going into this ending is not necessary either. For example, knight takes d6. I don't know if black plays queen takes c3. If queen takes c3, you can play rook c4. Gets sort of computery here. Like queen b6, you go knight back to c4 as one of the options, and then you try to take on a5, and then try to argue this e5 pawn is perhaps weak. This is what white should do, and I'm trying to remember how I was reaching the ending, because I was definitely considering knight takes d6 instead of trading queens, but somehow still this variation branch was reaching an endgame. Could not tell you how that was, but anyways, I figure black is, you know, active enough, and these pawns aren't that weak, and he can throw in rook f4 at some point. This rook can go to b2. You can try to avoid getting back rank mated. And I thought black was okay. The knight comes to c6. This pawn is defended, and I didn't see any way to put further pressure on it. The knight can come to c4 and attack it once. The rook from a5, the a5 square is covered by a knight coming to c6. So this didn't look that convincing for me, although given the ridiculous time trouble I was in already by move 20, 22, 23, I should definitely have bailed out and gone for the sequence and gone for a sort of more simple position. And this is what I was intending, but I decided to improvise the move completely mistimed, rook a3. And my idea was, okay, my b3 pawn is covered adequately, and therefore next turn I'm going to play knight c4, I'm going to be hitting this pawn, and I'm going to be hitting this pawn. And one of them is going to fall, and I'm going to have a good position. Strategically, this assessment is kind of off. First of all, there's the move queen c5 still. I figured I would go queen a1, because there's no a4. But there's just knight c6, and on knight c4, nothing's attacked. Like, if you manage to get rook to d1 in, you might make another threat, but as it stands, black can just play rook to b5, and, like, if you play rook d1, well, rook d1 you can't even play because you hang the f2 pawn. And this is quite silly, because, yeah, I'd spent time on my previous turn thinking about the ramifications of knight to c4, and then I decided to go for a move that I'd thought about for maybe 30 seconds because it looked nice. So queen to c5 I think is fine for black, and white's idea just doesn't work. But actually black has an even stronger move, and I realized this while my opponent was thinking. My opponent spent, I think, about 5-6 minutes here. I saw the idea, and I felt immediately, like, very, very silly, because this idea shouldn't work. But it only works because I've played bishop takes e6, helping black's position, and then played rook a3. And both those moves enable black to play d5 here. which is a break. Yeah, if black manages to successfully get it in, white should feel probably rather silly about himself. And the point that I missed, I assumed this wasn't possible, because again, I spent about 30 seconds actually considering this rook a3 move. I thought this wasn't possible, because, well, the d5 square is attacked twice, is defended 3 times. The only thing I'd really considered was that takes, there's no pin, because the queen hangs. Alternatively, there's no pin because you can defend it with c4. Simple move here, just queen c5 wins a piece. Probably queen d6 as well. But yeah, queen c5, and then just white just feels rather silly. You can go for compensation for the piece by going b4 and at some stage taking on a5, but black's just better now, of course. So I had to, while my opponent was thinking, he spent, yeah, a decent amount of time on this move, but it's a good move. I played queen a1, and the idea of queen a1 is to make a threat, and then, well, it's a pseudo-threat, it's not really a genuine threat, and then try to bring the rook to d1. But already at this point, I've got 2 minutes left, and the position is starting to open up. Black is quite active. My king side is a bit weak. The rook's coming to f4. d4 is maybe a possibility. Might double on the f-file. The queen is pressuring this diagonal. The knight might come somewhere. And already, it's almost time to panic for white, even though, that's what I thought. I thought it was almost time to panic, even though the position, according to the computer, is still slightly better for white. So queen a1, and here, okay. First of all, if rook takes a5, well, black hasn't made a move yet, but if black does something and rook takes a5 is played, after queen takes b3, white has not won a pawn, and will not win the pawn on d5 because it's covered enough times, with the shoutout going to the queen on b3, covering backwards diagonally. Black played the move rook f4, which the computer doesn't think is the best, but, you know, with your opponent in time trouble, it's a good scary move to make. Well, okay. D takes e4 is possible, but I figured D takes e4 I wasn't too worried about because of knight c4. And finally my knight manages to get into this nice square, and I can take on a5 at some stage. I can think about taking on e5. Same deal with d4. I thought d4 wasn't good because of knight c4. d4 otherwise ordinarily might be a scary move, but I wasn't scared of it here because I can bring my knight to c4. Knight on c4 is very good because it attacks both of black's currently, you know, sort of half-weak pawns on e5 and c5. Therefore, yeah. What does the computer say you should do? Oh yeah, I was suggesting d takes e4. I think queen d8 is fine as well. Queen d8, I mean, yeah. Queen b7. Thing about moves like queen d8 and queen b7 is when your opponent's in time trouble, they, you know, when you see queen d8, you sort of, you get to relax a little bit. You might blitz out rook d8, rook d1 quickly or something, or blitz out rook takes a5, whatever move. But rook takes f4 really makes you, you know, it's a visually scarier move than queen d8 or queen b7. D takes e4, I guess, is sort of a visually scary move as well, but, you know, you're at least left with sort of the comfort that even if you drop a pawn in this sequence, black has triple pawns along the half-open e-file. So anyways, rook f4 targets the pawns on h4 and e4, and the rest of the game I think was played more or less accurately. Like, the Stockfish 10 doesn't flag up any... Well, it flags up one inaccuracy later in the game, but okay, that was already by the point that it's probably just a draw. So, e takes d5. Well, okay, both these pawns are attacked. If rook a5, queen b3, yeah. I don't particularly want to drop this pawn. That seems like it would be quite bad. So I took on d5, he took on e5, and now, well, this pawn is loose. He can maybe think about going rook here, and doubling and targeting this f2 pawn. This is sort of the problem. I'd like to play rook d1, I think, but it does leave f2 quite weak. So I took on a5. He took on b3, of course. It's a natural reaction. And I played g3. There's also some possibilities of playing like rook a8, but I don't think it works here. I was going to say I don't think it works here because black can grab on h4, but the computer says this isn't good. Just queen a7. Okay, fair enough. Or g3 first, and then... There's this idea... Actually, I'd seen this idea of playing rook b1. Queen takes b1, queen takes b1, but I wasn't... And rook takes a8, but I wasn't sure how to assess the position with the queen against the two rooks. And again, keep in mind, to be entirely fair to me, and to my opponent, I had... Well, I had less than a minute left at this point. I was sort of going... above and beneath a minute in time left. My opponent had under 10 minutes left as well. And the position is still fairly complex. Complicated. So I played g3, just wanting to safeguard this pawn. Arguably slightly inaccurate because, as I sort of expected him to, he played rook f to f8. Rook f to f8, just stopping any things from happening over here. Rook to f3 looks nice, but probably you won't be doubling here because probably some back rank things will happen. So rook f to f8, I decided, okay, there's no doubling anymore that I have to worry about, at least not for the time being. So I'm going to play rook to d1 and pressure this pawn. Actually, once again, originally I was intending to try to bail out into an endgame with the move queen to a3, which is a bailout because it hits the knight as well. So probably black is best advised to take on a3. Rook takes a3. This ending I don't know how to assess. Computer probably says equal. Computer actually says a tiny bit better for white, which I guess I agree with. But when black has these center pawns, you're never entirely sure how to assess it in less than a minute. Could they be weak? Could they be strengths? Could rook b2 be a problem? Rook f3, rook over. I figured this was fine for me, but I thought, okay, let's just play rook d1. I can maybe bail out into an endgame later. I got some nice pressure on this pawn, I think. So let's just leave it at that for now. Well, there are plenty of decent moves for black, but my opponent played, I think, a particularly decent one. Quite a good move. d4. Very clever move. And the point is twofold. Well, I didn't think this was possible because I'm defending this square more times than he is attacking it. I'm attacking this square more times than he's defending it. But after c takes d4, the point is knight c6. Nice move. Hitting the rook. And then preparing to take on d4 with the pawn or the knight. Not sure which. Pawn comes with tempo and gives a passed pawn. Although if you have the chance to take with the knight, you might do that because it might hop into some scary squares. Not sure. But anyways, can't white play rook a3 and hit the queen? But by this point I'd seen the point, which is queen to f7, which is a very nice move. Backwards diagonal, hitting f2, so gaining the tempo that black needs to take on d4. And very nicely opened this diagonal by pushing the pawn to d4, enabling the queen to swing backwards. So this is a very nice idea, I thought, by my opponent. Queen to f7. I played queen to a2 after a brief moment of panic. Queen a2, he played e takes d4. Probably also possible to swap on a2 straight away, but I mean, I guess he wanted the rook to come to d2. E takes f4. E takes d4 is probably a fine move. I don't think you can really endeavor to keep the queens on the board. Well, computer says you maybe can. Queen f6. And just play, for example, and just play for compensation after d takes e5. Knight takes e5 with some threats around the king. Although actually knight g4 might be a stronger move. And whoops. Spoilers. Queen f3, probably possible as well. Probably a better move than queen f6. Takes. Or knight b4? No, okay, takes. And white's up a pawn. Maybe this is a good way to play with white in time trouble. There's still potentially some threats around the king, and the computer says that black is full compensation for the pawn, which I agree with. But okay. He simply played e takes d4. I took on f7. Oh, and okay, let's look quickly at the other way of entering this endgame. Queen takes a2, which I thought was, well, I guess we both thought it was a less good move. Takes here. There's no rook d2, but the ending should still be fine for both sides nonetheless, although you do have this nice idea of playing knight g2, knight f4. Like, something to keep in mind. So anyway, he went e d4, queen f7, rook f7. I played knight c2. Again, about a minute left on the clock at this point. Computer wants, well, thinks every knight move is about equivalent. Fair enough. I was still sort of panicked from, allowing d5 and, maybe being in trouble. I just played knight c2. And he played g5. Well, okay, there's some lines here where this pawn is attacked and defended, like rook d7. You can try to blockade it with the knight. You can play simply rook a d3, but here, yeah, you can probably just defend it. White can try to bring the king in, but yeah, nothing really much is happening there. Or you can play knight e5, which I'd actually overlooked during the game, with the point that you can't take this because of knight f3 check and taking the rook. So maybe knight e1 is advisable here, or king g2, or rook a6. But simply rook c8. And white's maybe a little bit better, but okay. It's going to be a draw most likely. So knight c2, he played a nice move g5. And the point is, after, well, you're avoiding back ranks, and after h takes g5, you play rook b2. And you have to avoid back ranks to play rook b2, otherwise rook a8 check is going to be a problem. And, well, I guess he thought moves like h6, g6, or king g8 were too slow, so he played it just in a forcing way, g5. And, yeah, it's a good enough move. h takes g5, rook b2. I took on d4 just because, you know, time travel, I don't want anything further weird to happen. Let's just steer it towards a draw. Computer says it gives us as an inaccuracy and wants rook c1 instead. Okay, I mean, this looks kind of like a draw as well. Rook to f5. White's too tied up to really do anything. And the line the computer gives here is knight e1, rook b takes f2, knight d3, rook 2 to f3, rook takes c6, rook takes g3, king h2, rook f takes g5, rook a8 check, rook g8 takes. Yeah, it's a draw. But okay, I played knight takes d4. He played knight takes d4, rook takes d4, rook b takes f2, and I just played rook f4 and offered a draw, which he accepted. So yeah, I mean, that's not the worst result that could have happened, but I had to think a nice position earlier on. And just two really silly decisions. It basically, this game comes down to two moves essentially on my part that were just, bishop takes e6 wasn't, okay. Bishop takes e6 I won't count as the silly decision. Let's just say it comes down to one particularly silly decision, rook a3, which just goes against, yeah, it goes against, first of all, the principles that I'd established earlier on, which is that this pawn structure is okay for black if it remains intact. And it just, yeah. And it also goes against the line that I'd calculated, decided to play, and at the last second decided to veer out. Yeah, don't do that. Just, if you're going to go for an alternative move that you haven't calculated yet, invest some time into thinking about it, about whether you really want to do it. Or, if you're in time trouble like I was, just don't do it. Unless it's obviously, you know, a winning move. Just don't do it. And rook to a3, bad move. Allows black to get d5 in. From the d5 moment forward, I sort of felt like I had to be careful to make a draw, although maybe that was just the time trouble speaking. Because if we look at the graph, the computer says I was never worse, except maybe for like a brief moment. I don't know, this dips underneath, but like this graph is it's a fairly solid graph. It has a peak here. I don't think it should have a peak here because I think this is just a draw no matter what anybody does, but I think it's just objectively a draw regardless of whether white plays rook c1 or knight takes d4. But yeah, rook a3 is a bad move. Made a draw. Computer says, you know, 3 inaccuracies, 0 mistakes, 0 blunders on my part, 12 average center pawn loss, 0, 0, 0, and 10 average center pawn loss from my opponent. So, although one of these inaccuracies I will dispute, I do not think knight takes d4 is genuinely inaccurate. However, if we look at the other ones, yeah. Bishop takes e6 I'll agree with, and rook a3 I'll certainly agree with. Rook a3 I think deserves more than a dubious symbol. Rook a3 I think straight up deserves a question mark. It's a bad move. Misguided. You had a chance to play rook a3 at a good moment earlier, and you didn't, and you played rook a3 at a moment when it was bad. Anyways, that was my game this week. See ya.